Welcome everyone to Leadership Focus 2021, presented by the Moravian Board of Cooperative Ministries. I'm Michael Terry, I'm the BCM's convener, and it's my privilege to open the series today and welcome our keynote speaker. Our keynote session is titled The Holy and the Hybrid, and our speaker is Ryan Panzer. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. Thank you for joining us this day. More than 130 have registered for this year's Leadership Focus event, including Lutherans, Presbyterians, and 50 brothers and sisters from the Moravian Church Northern Province. 62 congregations and agencies at least are represented from 3 Moravian provinces, including the Northern Province, Southern Province, and the Eastern West Indies Province as well. It's not too late to tell your friends and ministry colleagues about Leadership Focus 2021. We're just kicking things off today. So anyone can still register by visiting moravianbcm.org. Again, they can register at moravianbcm.org. And as you've most likely read, paid registrants will receive an email within 2 weeks of the end of the Leadership Focus series with recordings of this workshop, as well as other recordings and many other helpful materials and resources. This year's interprovincial event is co-hosted by the Board of Cooperative Ministries in the Southern Province, as well as the Healthier Congregations Task Force in the Northern Province. Thank you so much, Healthier Congregations Task Force. We will have time for questions and responses later in the workshop. Meanwhile, as you're doing, please make use of the chat box. Feel free to type in any questions while Ryan is presenting today, and we'll be sure they are addressed. Please remain muted, though, throughout the presentation. And, we just ask that, later you can unmute yourself, but just click that mute link. For most people, it's going to be in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Well, now it's my privilege to welcome Ryan. Ryan Panzer is the author of Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. Ryan's career has taken shape in the worlds of church leadership and technology. He received his MA from Luther Seminary while working for Google. Ryan continues to serve as a learning and leadership development professional in the technology industry. And he's also a lay leader at Good Shepherd Lutheran in Madison, Wisconsin, in addition to being a researcher on digital technology in the church. A student of digital media and its influence upon our lives, he is focused on coaching Christian leaders to imagine the church's hybrid future, a seamless blend of online and offline experiences in worship, service, and spiritual practice. He and his wife, Annie, and their year-old daughter, Alice, reside in Madison, Wisconsin, where I hear it's spring-like today. The sun is out. But when Ryan gets to take a break from researching, writing, and playing with Alice, you'll find him at attendance at nearly every Wisconsin Badger football game. It's my pleasure once again. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Panzer to Leadership Focus. Ryan?
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Hannah, and the Board of Cooperative Ministries for the invitation to speak with you all today and through the next weeks as well. I want to start by taking you back in time, 343 days ago to be precise. The sun was shining much as it is today. There was a sound of running water as melting snow came off of the streets and the sidewalks and ran towards the sewers and towards the drainage across Madison, Wisconsin. And on that particular day, March 13th, 2020, we had no idea how much was about to change in the world of church. We had no idea that in just 2 days, we would have to radically transform the way we are the church, that we lead the church, that we serve the church, and adopt a new model of digitally integrated ministry. I remember that day well. I was en route to Waupaca, Wisconsin to attend a funeral of a beloved family member. And on that afternoon where the sun was shining so bright and the hope of spring was in the air, there were also the realities of the worsening virus situation, to say nothing of the grief of the family member we had lost. We sat in that stately, compact Episcopal church in Waupaca, Wisconsin, recognizing that it would be one of the last chances we had to gather indoors for public worship. We had no idea at the time how long that interim would last. Remember, 2 days later, on Sunday, March 15th, I hopped on my bike. The winds were blowing. It was a gray, cloudy Sunday morning here in Madison. And I decided I would take a tour of the churches in my neighborhood, of which there are many. And what I saw that morning was quite interesting. Where I was accustomed to seeing full parking lots and lines of cars leaving from congregations and shuffling between services, I saw empty lots and vacant spaces. There were some churches I passed that morning where congregants mulled outside of the doors of the sanctuary, locked out, reading handwritten signs saying church this morning has been postponed. Some churches defiantly had kept their doors open, their parking lots remaining full, nervous looks on the faces of those shuffling into the sanctuary. But when I think back to those days, some 343 days ago, what strikes me is how quickly the world changed, how fast we had to reinvent the way we do church. And when I think about what comes next for Christian leadership, we have the gift of time. We have the ability to do some planning and to be thoughtful about what comes next. We don't have to re-alter everything in just 2 days. And so what I hope for with this time together is that we can start to think about what comes next for being the church in this tech-shaped culture, for being the church in a time of pandemic illness, and for being the church in a digital age. My name is Ryan Panzer, and I'm the author of Grace and Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. As Michael said, I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and my background is a unique blend of church leadership and digital technology. I actually started my career while working for Google in digital advertising and later in manager development. And I think to this day, I might be the only Google employee to have ever completed a seminary degree while working for the Silicon Valley tech giant. As I was working at Google, I started to realize that the influence that the digital age had on our lives was about a lot more than tools on a screen. The influence that technology on our lives, rather, was so profound. And I noticed this because the search technologies, the search engines that Google built, had started to weave themselves into all kinds of different devices. Today, I'm sitting in a house where there's a search engine that's integrated not just into my computer, but into my phone, into my tablet, into my thermostat, with my washing machine, and my doorbell. There's something interesting about digital technology in that it's grown from a place that we go, a thing that we access, a thing that we do, to something that's so integrated into the fabric of who we are, what we know, and what we believe. So when I talk about the church and technology, what I'm primarily interested in is not the idea of the technology itself, but the way that the technology is acting on our culture, causing us to think a little differently, to gather differently, to converse differently, and how we in the church can respond to those changes in a way that's thoughtful and engaging. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a few of the trends that I've noticed throughout my research and writing. And as I do that, I would invite you to make this a two-way conversation or a multi-way conversation. I have the chat in front of me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have throughout our time together. And I'll mention this closer to the bottom of the hour, but this is actually the first of several gatherings we'll have together. We'll meet again next Tuesday, Thursday, and the following Tuesday to dig a little bit deeper into topics of hybrid ministry. Now, I want to tell you a little bit of a story, again, going back to March and April of last year. When the stay-at-home orders went into effect, I was quickly searching for something to do, some kind of way to occupy my time, so I wasn't so beholden to the doom scrolling and the anxiety that was so prevalent in digital spaces. So I tried to do something that was decidedly analog. I decided that I would refinish my dining room table. Now, to figure out how to do that, I, of course, accessed the resource created by my former employer, and I asked a question: how do I refinish that dining room table? Google answered that question not just with a set of directions, but with a set of questions to continue my learning and exploration. Google encouraged me to think about how much it costs to refinish a dining room table. Well, it turns out it costs more than you would think. How long it takes to refinish a dining room table? Well, when you've got a 1-year-old at home, it takes a long time. Google answered my question not with a specific answer or a one way of doing things, but by opening the door to a broader conversation, to more questions, to more inquiry, and to allow me to explore where my curiosities called me to go. And what's interesting is when we look at Google in the context of Christian community, we actually see a similar pattern. This is a snapshot of data from Google Trends, which is an indicator of consumer interest or consumer demand based on search query volume. Now, what you'll see here is the term "who is Jesus?" And this maps out the search volume, the number of people searching this phrase on Google going back to 2008. What you'll note here is a 75 percentage point increase in the searches "who is Jesus?" on the Google search engine. As it turns out, we're not just trying to refinish our kitchen tables by going to Google, but we're exploring the biggest questions, the most fundamental questions of our faith. Now, similarly, what is the Bible has a similar trajectory. A 75 percentage point increase on this particular search term mirrors exactly the interest in who is Jesus. Perhaps discouraging, though, for those of us who live and work within the church and whose vocational homes are in ministry settings. It's not the same story when we look at church searches. In fact, Google searches on the term church and church near me continue to decline year after year. What this says is that in digital spaces, people are asking the questions that we are called to be keepers of. They're engaging the topics, the stories that we are called to tell. They're just not necessarily asking it through the institution of the church like they once were. Now, this is somewhat outdated data, but this looks at the spring of 2020 and what happened with the first wave of the pandemic. And although things got much, much worse in the fall and early winter, when we look back on the spring and in those particularly terrifying early months, there was a surge in Google searches for prayer. It's a little bit hard to see, but we saw about a 30 percentage point increase in the United States for searches related to prayer. People aren't just asking who is Jesus or what is the Bible, but they're going to Google, they're going to the web to engage the spiritual practices that we're called to teach. So when I think about the church and technology, when I think about this topic of hybrid ministry, which is simply a fancy word of saying online and offline together, what I'm thinking about is an act of service, of an act of stewardship, of taking those who are most entrusted to us and bringing them to the knowledge of God by the Holy Gospel. Now, let's not confuse ourselves here. This is an important conversation, an important topic, regardless of our age and regardless of our background. What this data from the Pew Research Forum shows is that every generation continues to be active on social media and on digital devices. But most remarkably, it's not the millennials and the Generation Z that have the fastest growth with these devices. Rather, the generations that are growing the fastest with their use of digital technology are those who were born before 1946. My grandmother, who lived to be 83 years old, was an avid user of Instagram. She loved to post Instagram stories and to see her grandkids' Instagram stories. She had Bluetooth speakers, she had an iPhone, she had a Facebook page, and she wasn't the only one in her senior living community. When we look at the internet, when we look at the web, then we're talking about a mission field That's not in any way confined to the younger generations or to the millennials or to Generation Z, but all those who are entrusted to our care in the church. What's remarkable about the data about web usage is not just that, the web usage is increasing, but how quickly it's increasing. Since March of 2020, our usage of channels like Facebook, YouTube, and Netflix has increased by a third, which is quite a remarkable jump considering we were already visiting Facebook 150 million times per day in the United States. The pandemic has so inextricably moved us onto digital spaces that it's unlikely that our usage of digital technologies will ever drop below what it was prior to March. All these factors are why hybrid ministry, being present in face-to-face community and in digital community, is such an important opportunity for those of us in the church. Our calling is not just to bring to the knowledge of the Holy Gospel those who are entrusted to us who come to our building, but those who are entrusted to us in all communities, whether face-to-face or virtual. Now, I contrast this opportunity for mission with some of the sentiments that I found in my career while working and serving in different church contexts. And this is a quote from a retired clergy member who attends my congregation. And he had something to say to me when he found out I was attending seminary, but I was attending seminary on the internet. He said, "You're going to seminary online? Well, it's really a shame that you'll lose out on all of that community." As it turns out, when you look at theological education and seminaries in particular, the strongest seminary communities are actually those who gather in a hybrid of online and offline. My seminary community took classes together 49 weeks of the year on the internet, and we would gather in St. Paul, Minnesota for 3 weeks of the year every January, because who doesn't love the Twin Cities in January? What was so remarkable about that community, and though I didn't recognize it at the time, was that it was my first experience in a hybrid church community that brought together consistent engagement on a Facebook page and in message boards and in text messages and on websites with the strength of face-to-face connection that we enjoyed through 3 weeks of worshiping together, celebrating the sacraments, hearing scriptures and preaching, and gathering for a few pints at the local saloon as well. And when we look at the church and its presence in digital spaces, prior to March, it's a little bit of a bleak picture of where churches were. Prior to March, only about half of all churches had a website. Only about half of all churches were on social media. About a third of churches didn't have a Wi-Fi connection in their building. That's rapidly changed. There are some estimates that prior to March, only 2% of churches had ever live streamed a service. Now we would expect that number is likely closer to 100. We've grown, we've evolved, we've iterated, and we've implemented all kinds of innovative technologies. The question and the opportunity for church leaders is what's going to come next? What's going to happen as our buildings start to safely reopen? How will we continue this momentum, continue these inroads that we've built in digital spaces? How will we continue to form relationships that span across cyberspace and face-to-face community? Now, I know not everyone is bought in. I know not everyone believes in the strength and the utility and the vibrancy of Christian community online. And one of the resources I would recommend if you or your community is part of perhaps some of the resistors to digital ministry is a great book called The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World. It's by Professor Deanna Thompson, who teaches at Hamline University. And Professor Thompson actually found herself diagnosed with cancer. She was a professor of religion. She is a professor of religion, and she had never really believed in the strength of a Christian community that exists online. She always saw it as something superficial. What she found, though, is that as she was diagnosed with cancer and went through this journey of diagnosis and healing, was that she derived such profound strength from the community that gathered on her Caring Bridge website. This is an excellent resource if you find yourself surrounded by those who don't quite understand why the church should continue to exist in digital spaces after the pandemic has subsided. Most of us, though, probably get it. We probably understand that the digital spaces that the church has been called to are a part of the church's legacy of communicating and proclaiming and connecting and building relationships with those who aren't gathered in our physical presence. Dr. Heidi Campbell, who's a researcher of media and the internet at Texas A&M University, shared it as part of the interviews that I did for my book, that today's Facebook pages and social media platforms are rather similar to the papyrus that Paul used to write his letters on into the Roman roads that carried those letters across Europe and Asia. So when we talk about the journey to hybrid ministry, then, what we're talking about is shifting the church's practice in a way that makes it more resonant with our broader tech-shaped culture. In the book, Grace and Gigabytes, I describe how many of my tech coworkers, those I've worked with for years who have become my good friends and who rarely set foot in a church, have a certain set of perceptions of what Christian community is all about. Oftentimes those perceptions are unfair, unfounded, and somewhat unfamiliar, yet they exist nonetheless. And back when I could still gather at a coffee shop or a cafeteria for a conversation with my coworkers, our conversations would often turn to religion and to my work with the church. They would describe to me how they saw church as something that's fundamentally all about proclamation, whereas their experience in the tech-shaped culture had caused them to value experiences of questioning, of curiosity, of looking for multiple answers to many different questions. They would tell me about how they saw the church as rooted in hierarchy, whereas the digital environments that they were in which they were formed prioritized collaboration. Those same coworkers over coffee and beer and lunches and dinners would tell me about how they didn't necessarily want to be in an exclusively in-person environment because no organization that they were a part of was exclusively in person. They would tell me that they were most familiar with hybrid organizations that blended the online and the offline together. Finally, as the generation raised with YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram stories, they would tell me that they were concerned about the church's focus on passive consumption, about how attendees would go to a church and sit in a pew and listen and absorb, whereas they were more so looking for places where they could be creative and constructive and expressive. Fair or unfair, founded or unfounded, this is the challenge that we're up against when we think about hybrid ministry. It's not just that we didn't have websites or great apps or a consistent presence on social media prior to 2020. Those are important factors. When we talk about hybrid ministry, we have the challenge of having to change minds, to change perceptions, and to change the narrative about what the church is all about. So to think about what the church is going to be all about in the future, it's helpful to think about the way we were and what was great, but also not so great about the church that we used to be. And when we think about the church that we used to be prior to March 12th, March 13th of last year, there were some definite strengths. We were great at gathering. Our communities were strong. Sociologist Robert Putnam describes how the average churchgoer spent less than 30 minutes a week attending Christian church, attending worship, attending fellowship events at the church. Yet that small investment of time was the strongest creator of social capital in American society. Something was going really well about our face-to-face church communities. And it's important not to lose sight of it when we think about what comes next. Now, the church we became started on March 13th, and there were things that church did particularly well. In addition, that church was really great at creating connections at making relationships with those beyond our physical neighborhood. The church we became, the church we are now, remains particularly effective at comforting those who are going through difficult times, and of course, at surviving as an institution, of finding a way to live into new opportunities and new challenges. Now, there's still limitations of the church we are today and the church that many of us belong to. And a lot of those challenges have to do with passivity. I remember on Sunday, March 15th, my wife looked at me and said, well, should we watch church now? Suddenly this experience of church, which had once been a place we go, a community we belong to, the shared work of the people, we now used the same verb to describe our engagement with that institution that we used to describe watching something on Netflix. Do you want to go and watch church? So even as we did our best to survive in these times of COVID-19, to bring a word of comfort to an ailing world, to continue to create connections, we still didn't quite figure it out. There's still room for growth here. That picture, by the way, was my daughter and I and my wife at her baptism, which we celebrated in November. And what you don't see in that picture is the recording studio that my church had to assemble in April of 2020. So what's the opportunity then for us? What is the church we must become? I would argue that the church we must become is the hybrid church, the blend of online and offline, the church that is simultaneously in physical space, just as it is in cyberspace. The church we must become is a blend of invitational Christianity in that it provides us an opportunity to reach out into the vastness of cyberspace and to extend a word of invitation. Similarly, it's a church that's really good at equipping for service. I gave you the example of the social capital that was created in our in-person communities. When we create hybrid church communities, we aren't just good at extending the invitation, but we're great at equipping with capital, with discipleship, with lives of faithful formation. The church we must become is also deeply collaborative and committed to inclusivity and bringing together lots of perspectives for the shared work of the people. Hybrid ministry then is defined by its blends, a blend of the asynchronous and the synchronous, a blend of the analog and the digital, a blend of the neighborhood-based with the cyberspace-based. So I want to leave you, or I want to just mention a quick equation then that we can look at to define what hybrid ministry is all about. And then I'm going to pause there to see what questions, comments, or reactions we have so far. Hybrid ministry is perhaps best understood as a church that brings together a parody of online and offline experiences. If we're doing hybrid ministry well, or if we're doing hybrid ministry at all, there's no demarcation in the value or quality of experience between someone who connects to us through a screen versus someone who connects to us through a pew. There's equity, there's equality. Similarly, the hybrid church finds a way to equip individuals and communities for lives of faithful service using technology. Technology in the hybrid church isn't just used to broadcast or to stream, it's used to make disciples and to equip for service, to promote scripture reading and prayer and the practices that have formed the church's witness for thousands of years. When we bring these things together, the hybrid church becomes a deeply collaborative culture where many perspectives are welcome and involved. So I'll pause there. Questions, reactions, feedback, pushback, feel free to throw it into the Zoom chats. I would welcome any and all comments. Walter said several slides back, there was a word in script. What was it? I'm glad you caught that, Walter. Let's go back a couple of slides. That was the word sinner and saints in the same word, depending on which way you look at it. If you look at it upside down, it says saint. If you look at it right side up, it says sinner. This is one of the more clever designs to come out of the Lutheran tradition. You can get it on a bumper sticker. Several of my seminary friends got it as a tattoo. I wasn't quite that bold myself. That's that word in script. Ruth also just shared with me, if you want to unmute now too to ask your question, that's fine too. Other questions, thoughts? All right, so Megan asked, how do you integrate online and physical participants in worship? Megan, that's a great question. It has to do with three things. It has to do with inclusive language, it has to do with use of of the hardware, of the cameras and the screens, and it also has to do with worship leadership roles. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Carol asked how you get church members to understand the value of hybrid worship. And, Carol, I think that the best thing you can do is listen to why they think there's not value in hybrid worship if you're getting pushback. If you're getting pushback on further engagement with digital ministry, think about what they don't like or what they're skeptical of. I would encourage them to also think about the opportunities for inclusivity that it affords. When we create a hybrid worship, there's no such thing as a shut-in anymore because all are equally part of the same worshiping community. When we have hybrid worship, those who can't physically and mentally be in the sanctuary with us, or those of us who just don't have the time to be there on Sunday morning, can be there with us. A third of Americans work on Sunday mornings. So if we're doing hybrid worship, we're creating inroads for those 1/3 of Americans who couldn't be at our church just by virtue of their job. A couple other questions I'll respond to here. Beth asked, how do we address the limitation of bandwidth and equipment in addressing the hybrid model? Beth, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I get a lot. What I would encourage you to think about is not yet getting to the point of bandwidth and equipment, although that conversation is important. What I would encourage you to start to think about is why you want to do hybrid ministry. What is hybrid ministry going to allow your congregation to do? Start by trying to articulate why we want to be in these spaces, and then go into the technology from there. Just two other questions here. Suggestions for digital literacy and some parody in having and learning technology. Kay, an excellent resource is the Digital Literacy Toolkit. I'll post that here into the Zoom chat, and I'll also send it out as a follow-up as well. The Digital Literacy Toolkit is a resource for ministry professionals to continuously learn and to grow their capacities for digital ministry. There's also some resources I'm going to share with you at the end of our time together this afternoon. Last comment that I'm going to address comes from June. Seems to me that pastors trying to be both and are going to be overwhelmed. That's a really common concern, June, and it's worth addressing and worth constantly focusing on. There are technologies that allow you to be streaming your worship service online with little more effort than 3 taps of a button. Pan tilt zoom camera, for example, mounts to the wall of the sanctuary and can automatically start streaming to the web just by configuring some very basic hardware. So when we think about being overwhelmed, I think a lot of that comes from the perception of needing to create separate experiences for online. When we think about hybrid, what we're thinking about is creating parity, creating seamlessness, creating the same experiences at the same moments. In the same way that many teachers have found ways to teach virtually in the classroom as they've been teaching, or teaching virtually and teaching in the classroom at the exact same time, and they've figured it out. It's going to take a learning curve. There's no doubt about it, but the opportunities are there if we can, again, figure out the why. What is it we are hoping to accomplish? All right. So let me talk a little bit about each of these ingredients of hybrid ministry. So thinking about parity first, the parity of the online and the offline experience. That's the first step in this equation. What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, we want to think about worship and how our experience of worship should be rooted in this equity that someone online should have the same experience as those who are offline. That doesn't mean we have to have a full media team. A great start is just to have somebody having some form of a camera within our sanctuary. That can be an eighth grader with an iPhone. What we want to think about, though, with the experience of worship is to do just enough so it seems like we're valuing the experience of those who are gathered online. I talked about the pan-tilt zoom camera that can be mounted on the sanctuary wall. The most common experience of streaming worship prior to COVID was a camera at the very back of the sanctuary, usually in the back row of the balcony for churches that had balconies. And while that was great for beaming shots of people's heads across cyberspace, a lot of bald spots on YouTube through that use of technology, what I would encourage you to think about is how we can position our hardware and software in such a way that makes somebody who's watching worship feel like they are sitting in the congregation, feels like they're sitting in the pews, in the rows, in the chairs of the sanctuary and worship center. When we think about parity of online and offline experience, we also want to think about faith formation in our Christian education efforts. Here, the parity doesn't necessarily mean that we are streaming our religious education classes. Rather, it means we're integrating our technology so that the same things that are learned in the classroom can be supplemented through digital resources. A lot of congregations have experimented with podcasts over the past year. And podcasts are a very simple technology. You just need an iPhone and some sound editing software. Parody in a faith formation setting just involves recording the content ahead of time, so somebody who can't be there synchronously still has access to learn, and so that those who can be there synchronously have the opportunity to go deeper into the subject matter. Finally, when we think about parity of online and offline experience, we should also be thinking about the way we lead our churches, the way we do our administration. When we have a conference call, is there a Zoom dial-in and a microphone so somebody who's unable to be there in person can still contribute to the agenda? When we work as a church staff, do we have Slack enabled? So do we use Microsoft Teams so that we can chat and collaborate in real time? A lot of the parity of online and offline experience starts with the way we administer our churches, the way we expect our staff to work, and the way we expect our council and board meetings to operate. That's a great place to start. The second ingredient that I mentioned, the second part of that equation, was the idea of personalized technologies that equip for faithful service, for acts of service. And just to give you a few examples of what those technologies can be, how can you integrate technologies that support scripture reading? Can you have an email newsletter with a daily piece of scripture in a daily devotion? Can you use a congregation app to send a push notification to encourage engagement with a Bible verse of the day? The same with prayer. Prayer is a really interesting topic right now because the apps that have been among the most popular during the pandemic are apps for contemplation, meditation, Calm, Headspace, Insight Timer. These apps have all seen an explosion in their business and their revenue. And it's not just because mindfulness is in vogue, but because people are really looking for practices that allow for an experience of grace and reset and disconnect during some challenging times. Third ingredient for personalized technologies is this idea of stewardship and gratitude. Can we use simple technologies to encourage giving? Most likely we've already set something up like that. But what about for gratitude? I use the Presently app every day. It sends me a push notification and asks me just to name one thing that I'm grateful for. And Presently is the most low-tech app on my phone, and yet it's among the most meaningful pieces of my day. When we combine those things, when we combine the parity of experience with the personalized technology, the result is a collaborative church culture. And what that looks like, and the way we know that we have a collaborative hybrid church culture, is that there's coverage in the sense that everything we do together as a church has some pathway or some portal towards digital and face-to-face involvement, that there's a certain quality of experience, minimum level of production value or of what I prefer, of intentionality, and that people are using both the face-to-face and the online opportunities to connect with our congregation. Now, I fully recognize that this is a lot to take in. These three factors of a parity of experience, of personalized equipping technologies, and of a collaborative church culture, that's a lot to think about. Fortunately, this Thursday afternoon, is the first of 4 conversations we're going to have together. And when we get back together on Tuesday afternoon, we're going to take a deep dive into worship specifically. When we get together the following Thursday, 1 week from today, we'll look at faith formation. And a week and a half from today, when we gather, we'll look at church leadership and administration. So we're going to be continuing these conversations, getting into some more of the specific tactics and the specific technologies that enable these things, and also addressing some of the concerns that a few of you have named in the chats. The fact that it's sometimes exhausting to do this, that it creates staffing challenges for small, sometimes rural congregations. And as Greg points out, it's sometimes difficult to do these things when not everyone has the same level of access to tech that allows them to participate. So when you come back and join us next Tuesday, Thursday, and the following Tuesday after that, we'll have a mix of sharing some content and some ideas, and plenty of breakout discussions as well for you to reflect about how these ideas work in your context. I want to talk a little bit, though, about change management, because the journey to hybrid ministry is, in fact, a journey of transition management and of equipping our congregations to manage a time of change. I continue to hear the question asked, when do you think things will go back to normal? It's hard to imagine that after a year and a half of disruption, perhaps 2 years of disruption, that anything resembling normal that we experienced in February of 2020 will ever be ascertainable. So if you're not familiar with some of the basic practices of change management, this is a great time to be equipping yourselves and exploring different practices and toolkits for guiding congregations through change. I'm a big advocate of the Bridges model of managing transitions, which describes how people go through a journey of change that's variable for everybody. Some are early adopters, some are laggards, some are resistors, some are change champions. But what you'll find is that everybody kind of goes through this idea of being frustrated, perhaps even a little depressed, before they get to the point where they're willing to experiment, to collaborate, and to commit to a new way of doing things. That's why our change journeys tend to look something more like this than the nice, clean distribution of change. When we think about change, it helps, I think, to map out where your congregations are at, to have a sense of awareness of who's going to be on board right away for the transition to hybrid ministry. To think about who might be a little indifferent, they'll be willing to go along with it, but they might not care all that much. And to think about who might be resistant or reluctant to go along at all. There's different practices we can employ depending on where our congregation is at. And it helps to try to understand, of my community, of my congregation, how many is on a percentage basis fall into each of these 3 categories, and who do I know that is a clear example of an early adopter, of somebody who's a majority, likely to go along with the change, and who's a laggard or resistor. You can tell your early adopters because when you talk to them about the future of church, they'll probably say something like, "Great, can't wait, been waiting all along, waiting for this all along. How can I contribute? How can I get involved?" The majority will probably say something like, well, I just can't wait for church to get back to, get back to the way things used to be. The resistors will tell you outright that they can't stand this. They just want things to go back to the way we were. What I want you to think about as we engage this conversation on change management, which we'll come back to in the coming sessions, is making sure you have opportunities for your early adopters to lead the way, to be visible, to share their ideas, and to make sure those ideas are acted upon. For the majority, what I want you to think about is getting them involved and getting them visibly participating in the aspects of hybrid ministry. And for your laggards and for your resistors, I want you to focus on listening to them and coaching them through their reluctance. I mentioned Deanna Thompson's book earlier about some of the resistance to hybrid forms of ministry, or the resistance to digital ministry. We would do a disservice to our Christian communities if we treated those groups as if they didn't exist. And what really motivates those groups is a fear of obsolescence. So take the time to be thoughtful and to listen to their concerns, to document those concerns, and to check back in with them, because they're going to come along with us for this journey, whether we want them to or not. And it's important that we give them a voice. Now, a couple more ideas I'm going to share, and then I'll open it up for a time of questions and answers. When we think about hybrid ministry, we're thinking about a process of moving beyond the box, of moving beyond social media posts and Zoom calls, and doing the same thing but virtual. And that's why one of the techniques we'll come back to is a process known as design thinking. This is something we'll talk about in the coming weeks. Design thinking is a practice for creating new forms of community, new ways of being together, new ways of creating forms of togetherness. It's actually a process that emanates from the technology industry. So my peers, my colleagues have been using this process for years to do things like build software and digital tools. But it actually scales quite well into a Christian context. When we look at design thinking, we have 5 steps of empathizing with our community, of defining a central challenge, of brainstorming, of prototyping, and of testing. So we'll come back to these concepts. We won't go into each of these in great detail right now. But what I want to do is just mention how this fits into the change management piece I already described. Design thinking, designing the hybrid church, depends on listening to the needs that are at work in our community, both expressed willingly and perhaps not so willingly. Now is a great time to be asking your congregation what they want from their church right now and what they expect from their church in the future. It's having this understanding of a shared sense of value and sense of purpose and sense of belonging that will enable us to design solutions for hybrid ministry that work within the context of limited staff resources and the realities of staff and clergy burnout. It's only when we do that work of listening and asking questions that we can really define the parameters of the challenge we're working through, to understand what the question is that we're trying to address. I might actually suggest the question of how do we do hybrid ministry? How do we build hybrid community is too broad of a question. An interesting question might be, how do we retool our faith formation programs so that those who can't be with us on Wednesday nights can still learn just as much as those who can be with us? That's a problem that we can address, that we can work towards, that we can collaborate on. The idea of how we build hybrid community is a little bit difficult to actually progress towards. From there, once we've defined the problem, we want to get together and brainstorm as many ideas as possible. Church leaders tend to be pretty good about this. We tend to have a lot of whiteboards and chalkboards in our church facilities. Make use of them. This is the time to brainstorm and to have lots of ideas. And while we're waiting for the end of the pandemic, we can see ourselves becoming facilitators and curators of lots of ideas, so that as church buildings can safely reopen, we have an idea of what that might look like. The last two steps in the design thinking process are prototyping and testing. Prototyping is a fancy way of saying, let's take an idea from the brainstorm, let's build it out a little bit. Let's draw out what that looks like. Let's tell some stories of what it could look like, what it could feel like, what it would do for our community. And then testing is simply the idea that everything we try in the context of hybrid ministry is an iteration. And as an iteration, it's going to change. We're going to try new things. We're going to try a lot of things that aren't going to come even remotely close to working. And that's okay. We're going to try some things that burn out our clergy. Not ideal, but it's going to happen. We're going to try some things. We're going to put some things online that nobody's going to watch. Not ideal, but it's going to happen. When we think about hybrid community and living into the church's new normal, we have to have an iterative testing-based mindset, knowing that we're never going to arrive quite at that final vision of what hybrid ministry is all about. With that in mind, I want to share in closing a few rules for spiritually wise hybrid ministry construction, for doing this work without burning bridges and burning ourselves. The first rule is that this takes time. Nobody's going to get this right in August of 2021. No one's going to have this right in August of 2022. Be persistent, be iterative, and realize that there's going to be a lot of ideas we'll have to test and reject before we get to a place of stability. The second rule is the idea that we need to be finding a way to promoting some kind of ability to unplug, to experience Sabbath, to create an experience not just of connection, but also of disconnection. I shared the data earlier about the 27% increase in Facebook usage since March. We're at a point where our levels of digital connection are perhaps approaching an unhealthy point. How in our hybrid communities can we create space to not just plug in, but also to unplug? And finally, one thing really well is always going to be preferable to being always on. If we find one way to bring our worship service online, and that's what hybrid ministry looks like for us, that's a success. And that's more of a success than the church that tries to implement hybrid in every single aspect of their community life and burns through their budget and burns through their staff energy and well-being in the process. Try to find the one thing, to test for the one thing that you're going to make work, and we'll start from there. So I know there are a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to pause the screen share and let's have some conversation. Feel free, by the way, to take yourself off mute for the remaining 10 minutes or so we have together. Carol, just to start with Carol's comments, Carol says we may not need to hire and pay someone on staff, but at least tap into some younger members. And she has a story of what that looks like. And what Carol mentions is something many churches have found. The skill sets exist within the community. They particularly exist with younger members of the community. Churches often, grumble, why aren't young people coming to us? Why aren't young people showing up? This is an opportunity to go to the young people in your community. Tell them you have something we desperately need. You have a skill that's so needed in our church. We would love to learn from you. Maybe we'd love to compensate you for that work. I've worked with churches here in Madison that are doing just that. We're a university town, which means we have tens of thousands of young people who don't, who wouldn't dream of setting foot in a church on a Sunday morning before noon, but they're really good at tech. And what the churches I've worked with have found is that they're more than willing, they're eager to get involved in a leadership role where they can be collaborative and let their expertise be meaningful. A couple of other questions here in the chat. Walter says that I use the word community often. That's certainly true. What do I actually mean by that? Walter, what I'm referring to is that the sense of togetherness and belonging that constitutes being part of the body of Christ that is the church. So a church community, for example, is all those who have gathered for the sake of hearing the words and celebrating the sacraments and of being together for worship, prayer, and other spiritual practices. There's a distinction between Christian community and neighborhood. The neighborhood refers to the surrounding environment in which a church is situated. And that's also an interesting thing for your church to be thinking about. What is our neighborhood now? And what's our neighborhood going to be as we continue to venture into digital spaces? Because you might just find out that the physical proximity neighborhood you've long thought of as your neighborhood might not be the neighborhood that becomes, the neighborhood of the hybrid church. Ruth mentioned training a teenager to run the live stream, and that's a paid opportunity. My church does something similar. And Carol also mentioned, seems like the denomination needs to take the lead. Pastors can't do it alone. Carol, I think that's perhaps a good segue here. I do want to leave you with a few resources before we wrap up our time together. There's a whole course list that you can have access to through two teaching networks that I've done some work with. One is the eFormation Learning Community through Virginia Theological Seminary. It's a community that puts on conferences and workshops and webinars, even office hours, to help clergy and church leaders figure out digital technology. Give them a follow on social media, subscribe to their newsletters. They're a treasure trove of resources. As is Faith Lead, which is a platform through Luther Seminary. I teach on hybrid ministry and digital ministry through Faith Lead. We have everything from boot camps to webinars and workshops to coaching communities and cohorts, all kinds of different ways to learn these topics. So the resources are out there. Carol, you are correct, though, that there is a shortage of insight and best practices that are documented around hybrid ministry. This is a new challenge we didn't know we needed in February of last year. So if you find something that works for you, if you find something that resonates with your church community, my suggestion is to share it. Put it on a blog, share it with your denomination. Find a way to connect with fellow parishes, because if you find something that works, we all need to learn from you. There's a lot of books too that will guide you through many of these processes. I mentioned Deanna Thompson's Virtual Body of Christ. Two other books I highly recommend. Keith Anderson's Click to Save is, as it says, the digital ministry Bible. It's essential how-to tips on everything from streaming services to starting your congregation's first podcast. It's a fantastic resource. And a friend of mine named Dave Dalbert just released a self-published book called Becoming a Hybrid Church, which is meant as a conversation guide for councils and foundations to think about what it means to be a hybrid church in different aspects of the church's life together. A couple of closing comments then. Like I said, this is meant to be the introduction. So if you're feeling like, wow, that was a lot, I don't really know where to go from here, that's okay. We're going to resolve that ambiguity. We're going to get to a point of concrete applicability soon. So I hope you'll join us next Tuesday and next Thursday and the following Tuesday after that. Same time, same Zoom link, when we'll get into the specifics of worship, faith formation, and church leadership. Lastly, I did write this book about what it means to be the church in a tech-shaped culture. And Ruth just posted the link to the book. If you're looking for resources, I also offer a weekly-ish newsletter on hybrid ministry and ministry in a digital age. And I would love to see some of you join in that community. Just in closing, when I look back on that weekend, March 13th through the 15th, I don't think I ever once thought that March 13th, 2021 would come and I still wouldn't have set foot in the sanctuary with my church community. We are truly living in unprecedented, unexpected times. You cannot overstate that. So I always want to close by commending church leaders for their agility, for their steadfastness, for their sense of innovation, for their daringness to proclaim the gospel to a hurting world and to find new ways of sharing that proclamation. Very much looking forward to working with you throughout the next week and a half. May God bless each and every one of you on your hybrid ministry leadership journey. All right, well, thanks everyone. As Ruth mentioned, there's going to be an email with the recording as well as some of the handouts and some of the resources. Ruth's posting some of the other resources in the chat as well. I will look forward to seeing many of you on Tuesday.
Thank you, Ryan, for your hopeful words and for sharing your valuable and timely insights with us today. Thank you, everyone, for great questions and comments. Again, Ryan's book titled Grace in Gigabytes, check it out. RyanPanzer.com, you can register for an email. Information about Leadership Focus 2021 and much more is available at our website, moravian.org/BCM. Thank you all so much for joining us today.